Hello everyone, this is Ron Ritchhart. I'm a senior researcher here at Project Zero, and I direct the Cultures of Thinking project. I want to tell you a little bit about the talk that I'm going to be giving on Tuesday. My talk on Tuesday will be built off of the work that we've been doing in the Cultures of Thinking project. The Cultures of Thinking project began in 2005 at Bialik College in Melbourne, Australia. Bialik is a private school, students from 3 years old up to 18. In addition, the project also does work in the state of Michigan, currently in Oakland County, Michigan, working with public schools there and looking at school-wide change. In addition, we've done work with a number of international schools, so people have found these ideas useful across a whole variety of context. The way I will begin my talk is to engage people with this question: what do we want the children we teach to be like when they are adults? And I'm doing this to kind of help frame the work in terms of the context of what is it that we are trying to accomplish as schools, and to help people think about taking a long view of education, and in particular to link this work, the idea of a culture of thinking, the idea of visible thinking, to the very long line of research which has happened at Project Zero around thinking dispositions. When I ask people this question, what is a list of dispositions. And one way that I refer to this list, these various things like being curious and metacognitive and compassionate and independent, Ted Sizer used to talk about these things as the residuals of education. This is about what's left over, what stays with people in the long run. So encouraging people to think about that if education is really about cultivating these dispositions, developing these residuals, then we have to begin to think about, well, what are the role of our schools in helping children to accomplish that? And that leads us to this question of, well, how do schools help them get there? And this is really the bulk of the talk and where the talk will. And here I begin to talk about the idea of enculturation. And the Vygotsky quote, "Children grow into the intellectual life around them," I think beautifully captures this idea about what it means to enculturate. The other way that I begin to talk about enculturation is to talk about that every school is telling a story of learning. We are sending our students messages about what it means to learn, about what it means to be a thinker, about what kind of thinking are valued. And this is kind of a major thread of what I'll be talking about. And I think that from past experiences is also a theme which really resonates for people. And so you might hear that coming up in your study groups, people talking about the story of learning and what is the story of learning they're talking about. I'll help people think about what are they doing in terms of, not what are they doing, but what is the story of learning that they were told first as a student, and covering some of that, and then looking at kind of what is the new and more powerful story that we might be telling. We uncover the story of learning which has happened in the past and which is very common in school. We often talk about the story and the focus on work, and we'll look at a video and we'll begin to talk about, well, what are some new and powerful messages that can be delivered to students about what a story of learning is, what are some of the key things. And these are messages that we think that as we're talking about developing a culture of thinking, and as we're really defining, well, is the school a culture of thinking? Is this classroom a culture of thinking? These are some of the messages that we think need to be a part of that culture. So let me give you a minute just to kind of look those over. So this first one, I'm not going to go through all of these in a list, but this first one, the idea that learning is a consequence of thinking, that thinking isn't something that we add on, but that thinking is really something that is kind of part and parcel of what we need to do in order to help students to think, in order to help students to understand. So in terms of the Institute's through lines, in terms of thinking about how is it that we help to develop students' understanding, a key way that we do that is really by making sure that we get them to think. And we developed that, and that idea of also making their thinking visible is quite prominent. This is the definition that I'll also be presenting, and I think that this is a definition which might resonate with people and might be coming up in your study groups as well. So thinking about the cultures of thinking are places. So here we're defining them not just as classrooms, not just as schools, but anytime a group of people come together where learning is a part of what they do, there's the opportunity to create a culture of thinking. So that can be in a museum, that can be in a committee meeting, it can be in an organization, it can be in a family unit. So cultures of thinking are places in which a group's collective as well as individual thinking. So here this dynamic interplay between the group and the individual, and I think that's a theme which resonates in the work of other people at Project Zero, most notably the Making Learning Visible project, in which they talk a lot about group learning within that context. And then here in the heart of the definition, what we're really focusing on, making that thinking is valued, it's visible, and it's actively promoted. And so we really need to unpack those kinds of things. And so it's easy for people to say they value thinking, but I often push them to ask them, well, what kind of thinking is actually valued? And here it's the kind of thinking which is important to the development of understanding. And so in the Visible Thinking Project, as well as the Culture of Thinking Project, we often talk about the understanding map, which is a map of the kind of thinking which is important in terms of developing understanding. And so that map can be accessed from the Visible Thinking website. It's also in the book Making Thinking Visible and talked about there. So the kinds of thinking which are important within that. But to help teachers articulate, well, what kind of thinking is it important for students to do in my subject area to help them to build understanding? Then we want to work to make that thinking visible. Here, a key means that we do that in our project is through the use of thinking routines. And again, you'll probably have people interested in thinking routines, and there are a number of mini courses which will focus on thinking routines and give people an opportunity to actually experience those, whether that be in museums or in a more kind of classroom kind of learning environment within that. And finally, that the thinking is actively promoted, so we're constantly pushing students to higher levels within that. The last part here of the definition, as part of the regular day-to-day experience of all group members. So this is thinking really for everyone. This isn't thinking that we kind of add on, in a class here or a class there, but it really is the heart of what happens in classrooms. And this isn't thinking that's just for the gifted and talented, but it really is for all group members. This is also one of the things that we've seen in our project that has been, I think, incredibly powerful, is that teachers report when they really do strive to make thinking valued, visible, and actively promoted, what they notice is the playing field of the classroom changes, the dynamics change. We begin to hear more student voices in those classrooms. Students who are no longer, who were maybe previously didn't feel like they had any voice, they begin to contribute. They have ideas, and teachers begin to see those students in a new way within that. And then the question comes up about, what's the vehicle again for telling the story? How do we begin to tell that new and more powerful story of learning? How do we create that culture of thinking? And I'll close my talk by introducing the 8 cultural forces. And these forces originally came about from research that was done and written about in the book Intellectual Character. And this was research in classrooms, looking at independent school classrooms, urban classrooms, suburban classrooms, analyzing in those classrooms where teachers were very adept at creating a culture of thinking, very adept at cultivating their students' thinking dispositions and getting students to think, what is it those teachers did? And so this framework, beginning to kind of analyze group and organizational culture, so that this really is about group culture, not necessarily schools and classrooms, that this framework is shown to be very robust across a whole variety of contexts, for helping us to understand, well, how does culture, group culture actually form? And so these 8 cultural forces become the vehicles that we begin to talk about and move through. And so we'll look at those, and we'll look at a video and begin to kind of analyze that video of classroom practice kind of through that lens. Finally, I'll close off and leave people with 2 questions that I want them to kind of carry forward from the talk, thinking about the story of learning that they and their school are currently telling their students. Is that the story they want to be enacting? And then thinking how they can enact and communicate a culture of thinking and learning to their students, really from the very first of the school year. As students step through the doors of the classroom, how can they enact that more powerful story of learning? So I hope this kind of gives you an overview of what it is I'll be talking about, and look forward to seeing you at the Summer Institute. Bye.